Hello and welcome to our live Q&A with Robert Harris to discuss his latest novel, V2. I'm Harry Mount, a Telegraph contributor, and I'll be interviewing him for the next 40 minutes or so and then taking your questions. As this event is exclusively for Telegraph subscribers, I want to thank you for subscribing and for your ongoing commitment. Thank you also to our partners, Penguin Live, for making this event possible. I hope you've all read the book. If not, beware of some spoilers that may accidentally come up, and do buy a copy. It's my pleasure to introduce Robert Harris, one of our greatest historical novelists. Educated at Cambridge, he worked at the BBC before becoming political editor of The Observer and columnist at the Sunday Times and at the Great Daily Telegraph. In 1992, he wrote his first bestseller, Fatherland, about a world where Germany won the war. Since then, he's written over a dozen bestsellers, from Enigma and Munich to his celebrated trilogy about the Roman lawyer and politician Cicero. His latest book is V2, about the deadly German missile and the stories of a German V2 rocket scientist, Rudi Graf, and a British WAF, Kay Caton Walsh. Hello, Robert. Waiting for Robert to come in there. Hello, thank God. Hello, Robert. How are you?
All right. Yes. Hi. Nice to see you, Harry. And hello, everybody.
First question is how you came up with the idea of the V2 as opposed to anything else as the central structure of the book.
Well, I've always been quite interested in the V2, but I never really thought of writing a novel about it. But then 4 years ago, there was an obituary in the Times, I'm afraid to say, of a woman called Eileen Younghusband, who died at the age of 95. And she had been a member of the Women's Air Force in the war. And in her 20s, in the November 1944, she'd been one of a group of WAF officers sent to Mechelen in Belgium, newly liberated. Very secret mission. They were put in a bank vault. They were billeted on locals in the town, but they were put in a bank vault and issued with a slide rule. And their job was to calculate the parabolic curve of the ballistic V2 missile, which at that time was being launched from the coast of Holland, about 70 miles to the north. The theory was that obviously we knew where it landed in England 5 minutes after its launch. High-looking radars got a brief glimpse of its trajectory before it passed out of range. And taking those two calculations together, you could work out where the missile had been launched from and the RAF. If they could do it within 6 minutes, Eileen and her colleagues, they were told that the RAF had a reasonable chance of trying to bomb one of these mobile launch sites before the Germans could dismantle it. That was what was in this obituary. And I thought, my God, that's an interesting character. That she'd be worth writing about. So it started in that way, really, wanting to write a book about that sort of figure. I must say, the character I've invented, Kay, is completely different to Eileen, but she was the start of it.
Right. And for those who don't know, it came on incredibly late during the war, September 1944. Is that right, when the V2 first got going?
Yes, it was obviously being developed, well, from before the war. It first flew a successful test flight in October 1942. This was the most extraordinary piece of sophisticated technology. I would say it must surely have been the most sophisticated piece of technology on the planet at that time. It would go 60 miles into space. It traveled at 3,500 miles an hour. It was guided by onboard gyroscopes, controlling vanes in the fins of the rocket, and they were aimed at Charing Cross Station, and anything within 5 miles of that was considered on target. So its targeting was quite crude, but as a piece of rocketry, there was nothing like it on Earth. And the British started to pick up rumours that something was going on, and it was RAF Medmenham, the base for photo reconnaissance, which really alerted us to the looming threat. And my fictional character, Kay, works at RAF Medmenham, and I've used real life memoirs of that time where the women, and it was mainly women, who studied the photographs, worked out the test stands and all the other things that were going on in this vast rocket facility on the Baltic of Peenemünde, where the Germans were developing the rockets. So we knew something was coming, and in August 1943, Churchill himself visited Memberham. He drove down from Chequers, and in August 1943, a huge RAF raid took place on Peenemünde. The whole frontline strength of the RAF Bomber Command, 600 planes, 4,200 aircrew. So we knew that something was coming. We'd hoped to destroy the facility utterly, but that was impossible. The Germans switched it to an underground plant, and sure enough, in September 1944, the first V2 hit Chiswick at about 6:30 on a Friday evening.
And actually, I'll bring up at this moment the question that is in our poll, which viewers can join in on, which, as Robert says, the attacks began in September 1944. Our poll asks, was Germany already bound to lose the war by then? What do you think about that, Robert? This is obviously several months after D-Day. Was it a last gasp effort?
Yes, it was never a war-winning weapon, actually. First of all, it could only be used against a giant target like London or Antwerp, where they were the two places attacked by V2s. London attacked from the coast of Holland, which was the only place where London was in range from Holland, the only bit of Europe the Germans still had left to fire it from. And Antwerp was attacked from Germany. These were incredibly sophisticated missiles, but they could only carry a 1-ton warhead, which sounds a lot, especially if it lands at twice the speed of sound. But in fact, a Lancaster bomber could carry 6 tons of high explosives. So even though the Germans fired 1,300 of these fearsome weapons at southern England, it was never going to destroy London. It was never going to have as much effect, really, as one single massive British bomber raid on Germany. Hitler, I think he really put the huge investment into the project after Stalingrad, when I think he was grasping at anything that might turn the tide. And I think he thought perhaps conceivably this rocket, which the head of the program, von Braun, flew to his headquarters and showed him on film. I think he obviously thought this could turn the war. He said that war would never be the same after the V2, and he was right. I mean, war is now different because of this, especially as rockets can be nuclear tipped. But it was too late to save Germany, I think.
And that's what comes across very strongly in your book, that here is this incredibly sophisticated missile, which then has this rather random landing spot. But actually, you say at one point in the book that in a funny sort of way adds to the fear, because no one knows when and where it's going to strike.
Yes. I mean, it killed, I think, 2,700 people in London, which is awful. But in the context of the war and of the 50,000 or more killed by German bombing in the war, it's not a massive proportion. We were fortunate in that, by and large, it didn't hit the kind of landmark buildings which the Germans claimed that it had: the Houses of Parliament, Downing Street, Buckingham Palace, Tower of London, London bridges. The Germans claimed that these had been hit, Piccadilly Circus. In fact, most of the missiles fell short, tended to fall in Wandsworth or in Kent or in the southern suburbs of London. They did cause this terrible loss of life. They had an enormous destructive impact because they came in at this speed of about 2,000 miles an hour. They produced a shock wave which could radiate out for a quarter of a mile. And it said that 600,000 buildings were damaged in London by the V2, and that this was a major contribution to the post-war housing crisis. So, you know, it's not to be dismissed. This was, and it was a frightening weapon because the boom of it echoed over London, that sort of basin effect of London. And so people in London would hear a sonic boom, a crack as the thing came in, and then the boom of the explosion. And you might hear that 4 or 5 times a day, and you never knew whether they were going to hit. And people said it was a more frightening weapon even than the V1, which you would have thought would have been more frightening because you heard it cut out and then it started to fall. But at least you could try and get out of the way. With the V2, you couldn't do that.
And you also describe, without giving away too many plot points in your book, this very strange thing of somebody gets attacked twice and survives, but there's a slight change in the atmosphere before you're struck. What does that involve?
Well, the people who survived the V2, you didn't hear the V2 coming in and you couldn't see it either because it was coming in at this colossal speed. The human eye couldn't see it. And so you'd only hear the explosion after the missile had hit. What a lot of survivors mention is a kind of slight change in the air pressure caused by the rocket coming in and pushing the air out of the way. So there'd be this fraction of a second, almost as if the tide had gone out, a momentary change in the pressure, and then the rocket would hit. And quite a few people who survived V2s described that phenomenon.
Yeah, it's very sort of scary in the book. And you referred to the V1, which viewers will have heard of, but I didn't realize it was quite so close in time. That was first used in June 1944, is that right? So there's only 3 months later V2 came on. Was it considered the V1 wasn't quite good enough?
Well, the V1 was, there were countermeasures for the V1. I mean, they could be shot down as they crossed the coast. They were relatively slow moving. The RAF amazingly developed, with the skill of the pilots, a technique of flying alongside the V2 and flipping it with the wing of the Spitfire or whatever and causing it to crash. So, you know, there was something you could do. You could fight back against it. The V2, there was simply nothing you could do. I mean, we had spotter balloons. People, you might see a flash as it was taking off in Holland, right across the North Sea. There were acoustic devices to hear it, and then radar would pick it up as it was coming in. But as I say, it hit London 5 minutes after launch, so there was nothing you could do. And it was a scary weapon, and the government took care. I think it was about 2 months or more before the British actually admitted that London was under rocket attack. They used to put out that gas mains were exploding, which of course people by that stage in the war were quite cynical about. And they said, you know, have you heard about Hitler's new weapon, the flying gas main? So, you know, there was a sort of, you know, common knowledge that this was what was happening. And I think it did have a big effect on morale because, you know, they were supposed to be beating the Germans. A lot of people thought the war would end in 1944. And here we are suddenly with this extraordinary science fiction space age weapon being rained down on London. I mean, you know, that was, I think from what I read, obviously I wasn't there at the time, but I think when people were exhausted near the end of the war, I think it was a grim thing to think that whatever you did, you might be hit by this thing.
And obviously this is a historical novel, so there's fiction there, but you read very deeply into the subject. And in terms of the relationship between fact and fiction, you describe these terrifying V2s landing in Woolworths and Deptford and Warwick Court and the Inns of Court. Those are all genuine incidents, is that right?
Yes, I mean, what happened was that the Germans started firing them from the coast of Holland in September. Then there was Operation Market Garden, the attempt to take Arnhem and the Rhine bridges was launched, and they hastily withdrew in case they got overrun. When Operation Market Garden failed, they were able to come back, and they'd made improvements in the meantime to the delivery of the rockets from the factory, and they'd ironed out some of the problems. And so they started really firing them at the rate of about 40 or more a week. And in November, this really began to rise to a crescendo. And so I set my novel in the last week of November 1944, which is when this operation, the real-life operation in Belgium, was launched. And so I took actual launches from The Hague, the region around The Hague, and they are in the novel. And I even give the name of some of the casualties and the time when the rocket came in and so on. Because in part to just remind people that this happened, you know, this isn't some sort of fantasy, you know, this occurred. And I like to do that in my novels if I can, to give that framework of fact and to weave my fiction around it.
And it's completely fascinating. One of the extraordinary thing about these very sophisticated missiles is you can launch them from anywhere. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, that was one of the worst moments for British intelligence, I think, was that the Germans were preparing a huge bunker in France to launch these missiles from, which was very much, of course, the sort of thing that Hitler liked, gargantuan construction project. But in the end, they went with a sort of tow truck system of delivery and a very sophisticated kind of hydraulic mechanism to raise the missile upright. It was about 46 feet long. And they raised it with this hydraulic crane and then lowered it onto a launch platform, which was only 5 feet across. And they could set up at this launch platform on any country lane, on any road, in any car park or playground. And what they did was if anyone knows The Hague, you know that the woods there have got paved roads through them for cyclists and so on. And so it was a perfect cover, trees covering the launch site. It only needed a tiny gap in the trees to launch it. It took about 2 or 3 hours to get it fueled and ready to go. It was launched, and then it took them about half an hour or so to clear the site and take the convoy of vehicles and tankers and so on away. And this was a nightmare when we realized that this was how it was going to be launched. It became impossible to find them, to bomb the launch sites. And one of the curiosities of the book, of writing the novel, is that I realized that the obituary, which said that on the first shift, Eileen's crew made the calculations in time and the RAF destroyed 2 launch sites. I'm afraid they never did. They didn't destroy any launch sites. It was impossible. And even an attempt to carpet bomb the woods near The Hague was a disastrous failure and killed hundreds of Dutch civilians instead. I mean, it was an unstoppable weapon in every sense.
Because it's very gripping in the book. Your heroine, Kay Caden-Walsh, is doing these extraordinary calculations and trying to find where the launching sites are. In real life, is that the case that they did find the launch sites, but by the time they started bombing them, they'd moved, or they never actually found the precise sites?
Well, they knew more or less where they were. They were in the woods somewhere around The Hague, but that's quite a big strip of land. And, you know, the bombing raids, which were themselves very brave undertakings. Maybe viewers will remember Raymond Baxter, who used to present Tomorrow's World. He was one of the pilots who flew from RAF Coltishall in Norfolk to attack these sites. 4 planes, Spitfires, would go in line. They would roll onto their backs and dive 5,000 feet and release 2 bombs they carried, and then try and get out before they were shot down. So it was a precision attack. But I mean, you know, the limits of air power is something we've all become aware of, and it wasn't really possible to get the precise location of these places. So the Germans were able to get away. I mean, the raids harried them. There were successful attacks on trains and so on, supplying the missiles, but actually hitting a launch site, no, I don't think that did happen.
And there are so many fascinating aspects to the book, the extraordinary amount of resources that went into actually making the V2 with slave labor largely. Is that right? Yes, I mean, I should perhaps explain to anyone who hasn't read the book that the K is my English female character, and that was the character first attracted me to writing the story, but I needed a German figure as well, so I could tell the German side. And I invented a young engineer who's a friend of Werner von Braun, and who is, as some of these engineers were, sent from Peenemünde to the operational units in the woods around The Hague to coordinate firing the missiles. And a lot of these engineers knew that this was not going to win the war. And my fictional hero and von Braun and several others were arrested by the Gestapo for defeatism, because they went around saying that this thing won't work. And the SS, who took over the project, were highly suspicious, because the costs of the V2 program and the V-weapon program swallowed up the same amount of money, dollar for dollar, as the Manhattan Project. I mean, $5–6 billion, something of that sort. It was a huge proportion of the German
war economy for what was essentially a kind of Hitler's vanity project. You know, these engineers, quite genuinely, I think, they certainly came into rockets because they wanted to fly to the moon. Von Braun never made any secret of that, and of course we know his career after the war. And so the German military, or the SS in particular, thought that they'd been taken for a ride by these guys. And to some degree, they had. And
there's an extraordinary fact, if I remember this right, that 4 times more people were killed in manufacturing V2s than were actually killed by them in Britain. Is that right?
Yes, the RAF attacked Peenemünde on that full moon night with 2 aims, really. One, of course, to destroy the workshops and the factories which were being built there to manufacture the V2, and also to kill as many of the rocket engineers as possible. They failed to kill many rocket engineers, and they failed to destroy most of the test facilities, although they did damage the factories. And that it was realized then that the Germans would have to switch production away from this exposed Baltic island. And the SS came in then because they had this underground factory at Nordhausen, which had been a gypsum mine before the war. There was one long tunnel into the mountain, nearly a mile long, and they said, we can blast out another one, put cross tunnels between the two, lay a railway line, and the missiles can all be built there. Hitler had ordered 10,000 of V2s to be built. And they did it. They accomplished the building of this extraordinary factory simply by killing the slaves who built it. 20,000 are said to have died. They were sent in with pickaxes and they blasted and dug out the tunnel. And when they died from exhaustion, they were carted away, and a fresh lot were put to work. And so the appalling fact is that the manufacture of the V2 killed 4 or 5 times as many people as the weapon itself killed operationally.
That's extraordinary. And so your German hero, Rudi Graf, is fictional, but Werner von Braun does appear a very much real-life person who went on after the war, for viewers who don't know, to work for the US Army, went over to America, and then was instrumental at NASA and the Apollo space program. And there are sort of what do you call them, echoes of this before they happen in your book. That is it right to say that man wouldn't have gone to the moon in 1969 without the researchers that went on for the V2?
I think that that's almost certainly true. Yes, I mean, I have this theory that there were 3 places in the war, 3 secret bases, if you like, crucibles where the modern world was forged. Bletchley Park was one, where Alan Turing developed the computer. Los Alamos was another, where the atomic bomb was developed. And Peenemünde was the 3rd, where rockets were developed. And these 3 places shaped our modern world and continued to do so. And without the enormous investment of resources in the V2, there were 20,000 people working at Peenemünde, and the real cream of German engineering working there. Of course, this was a quantum leap, which put the world 20, 30 years on from where it would have been without it. That was why the Germans were so desperate to get their hands on von Braun and his team. And the Russians also took some of the blueprints and so on, and they did the same. So I think it's impossible to imagine mankind landing on the moon in 1969 without this colossal investment, without Werner von Braun. It would not have been done. It would not have been feasible. And you only have to look at a Saturn rocket to see, in a much more bigger, more sophisticated form, a V2 rocket, essentially.
And using very much the same sort of fuel. It's very fascinating, the combination of different fuels that are used in the V2. It's very similar, only 24 years later when man goes to the moon, is it?
Yes, I'm not an expert on rocket technology, or certainly not on the Saturn rocket, but the V2 was a mixture of oxygen, liquid oxygen, and alcohol, which was distilled from potatoes, oddly enough, the alcohol. They took the entire German potato crop in 1944-45 to make the liquid, to make the alcohol. And the mingling of these two under high pressure was what enabled the rocket to take off and achieve these colossal speeds. And the amount of refining and technical adjustments that had to be made. I mean, between the 1942 first test flight of the V2 and the first operational use in September 1944, the Germans made 60,000 modifications to the original design. So, you know, yeah, it was the technology that took us to the moon, effectively.
And this, forgive a rather fatuous question, but is he a sort of goodie or a baddie, ultimately, Wernher von Braun? Here he is. He is in the SS. You refer to him appearing in the SS and him making little amusing jokes about it. But he was in the SS, and then he goes off to America. Is it too simple to call him a goodie or a baddie?
It is a bit. I mean, I think that he was a technocrat, essentially. He was a bit like Albert Speer, who was a friend of his, something of a cold fish, I think, although he could be very charming. He was very good looking and had lots of girlfriends. He was a visionary. There's no doubt that his intention was always to try and get to the moon, and he didn't really care who paid for it, whether it was Adolf Hitler or whether it was John F. Kennedy. You know, he just give me the money and I want to build this thing. And he rather turned his gaze away, I think, from the appalling human cost, which he must have known about. If he was head of the development of the V2, he must have known what was happening in the factory that was turning his prototype into a weapon. It's inconceivable that he didn't. He didn't order it. He was caught up in the system, but he didn't stop his work. He didn't register any kind of complaint. In fact, as far as I know, none of the engineers involved in the program registered any kind of complaint. And presumably it would have been pretty prejudicial to their health if they'd done so. He joined the Nazi Party, it's true, in 1937. I don't think he ever went to any meetings. He just joined it because if you wanted to get this huge funding, you were expected to show your ideological purity. He took honorary rank in the SS when it was offered to him again, I suspect, simply because you couldn't be seen to turn it down. He was very lucky that he was arrested by the Gestapo for defeatism and spent 2 weeks in custody, because that became, paradoxically, a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card after the war, because he could say, well, you know, look, they picked me up as well. There's no doubt that if you watched all the documentaries and the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the landing of the moon, because I was writing the novel, I was very struck by the extent to which Wernher von Braun had been edited out of the history of the time. And there's no doubt also that some of the NASA engineers, the Americans, they didn't like having all these old Germans around because they knew where they'd come from. You know, if von Braun had lived on, he died in the 1970s. If he'd lived on, I think he might have found life more uncomfortable than he did when he was actually at NASA. And
was he ever confronted, actually funny enough, just now is the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials, was he ever confronted, or any of those senior German scientists, did they have to be tried in any way before they were poached by the Americans and the Russians?
No, they were flown out very rapidly. They all carefully headed south to the German area around Munich and surrendered in the summer of 1945 and handed over all the secrets, everything, and promised to cooperate. And they struck a deal, effectively. And I mean, about 200 or so, I think, were left on a liner and were taken over to America, and their families were taken over too, and they became American citizens. They lived out in White Sands in New Mexico for quite a long time, and then obviously as NASA developed, they moved to Florida and to Alabama and Texas. You know, there were the first sort of trial about the factory, I think, was in the 1970s, and one of the rocket engineers who was a Nazi, seriously, a proper Nazi from the early days, a man called Arthur Rudolph, he was threatened with extradition, and he had to retire and rather disappear. So the net was sort of closing by then, but conveniently, of course, after the Apollo program had finished.
And do you think this is ethical, just a bit of realpolitik on the part of the Allies? Is it that here are these brilliant men, let's use them?
Well, one of the things that I try to do writing my fiction is to bear in mind what people felt at the time and not to try and import our views, our values from today. By the end of the Second World War, there was blood on everybody's hands. You know, to some degree, the main British war effort had been bombing German cities. You know, there was a certain, you know, there was no ethical clean hands particularly anywhere. And people were brutalized. They'd seen a lot of death. The idea that if there was this incredible new development that the Germans had got, we should have it, makes a kind of sense. And so I think that it's understandable. There are moves now to take down Wernher von Braun's statue from NASA headquarters, to rename a building which is named after him, to rename a prize which is given in his honor. And this fits in, of course, with the whole issue that we've faced this year about statues and how do we deal with the past. You know, which is a very deep issue and a complex issue. But personally, I think as a novelist, my job is to try and describe things as they were at that time, and not to try and go back and with hindsight and bring the values of 70, 75 years of relative peace to judge people who'd been through so much in 1945.
Yeah, and I referred in the introduction to Fatherland, your wonderful book about what would happen if Germany had won the war. You've also brought up the war in Enigma and Munich. Why is it such a juicy, fantastic subject? Because it's so recent and it was the biggest conflict of all time. Why does it keep on producing those sparks, like with the obituary of the WAF officer who produced the character of Kay?
Well, someone asked me they said, why are you obsessed with the war? And I could only say, well, why aren't you obsessed with the war? It seems to me such an epic episode in human history, the biggest, the most upheaval, the most extraordinary ideological clash and technological breakthroughs and social revolution. All of it came out of that period around the Second World War. It shaped our modern world. It's not that long ago, you know, 76 years ago, there are people who remember the V2. They were there, they were alive as children in London. In fact, I did a talk to my old college the other day, and the senior tutor got in touch with me afterwards, now distinguished, retired. He said he remembered a V2 hitting the cliffs near Folkestone. You know, so this is a living thing. And as I say, the technology and the rest of it all shapes our world. It shapes what kind of country we are and how we look at the world, and it shapes the Europeans and how they look at the world. And you know, so I don't think there's. I think it's, as well as providing, I may say, good stories, which is what I hope V2 is. It's not just a history of the rocket. It's about two characters caught up in the war. But no, I mean, I don't regret writing about the Second World War. I think it's fascinating.
And the same applies to your other historical novels, which cast all the way through history back the 2,000 years. That you've been particularly interested in ancient Rome with your book Pompeii and your trilogy about Cicero, the famous politician and lawyer. Do you think ancient Rome provides the same spectacular conflicts as the Second World War?
Yes, I mean, the Roman world, I mean, I'm interested in politics, so, you know, I always have been. And I wanted to write about Rome, partly to recreate it and characters like Cicero and the town of Pompeii. But so that's part of it, to try and, in the Cicero novels, recreate the extraordinary Roman Republic, the system of voting and speaking and so on, to write, if you like, to put it crudely, a West Wing on the Tiber of men struggling for power within that system. To recreate it, but also to use it as a kind of allegory or a mirror to our own time, because the Romans were very similar to us. Of course, there was terrible cruelty and no conscience, and they didn't have the Christian ethics. But in many other ways, they were just like us. And in many ways, I dare even say, more sophisticated. There isn't a better orator than Cicero. There isn't a better poet than Catullus or Virgil or Horace. There isn't much better architecture. They were extraordinary. And so you can write about people long in the past who nevertheless, Cicero in particular, seem very modern.
And to bring things up to the present day, just before we move to questions, you started your career as a distinguished journalist and political correspondent. Do you think this year, with first COVID and now the Brexit deal either coming off or not coming off, is the most extraordinary year in British political history since the war, really?
Yes, I think that that's unarguable. I'm 63. I was born in 1957. For the whole of my adult life, British politics has revolved around Europe. Macmillan trying to get in to Europe, failing with de Gaulle, Wilson trying the same, Heath taking us in, Mrs. Thatcher's arguments, and so on. It's always been at the centre of British politics. And now, for the first time in my life, we are cutting off and going. And that is, whatever you think about it, that is a seismic event for this country. And then if you combine it with the COVID, the pandemic, this once in a century event, which has upended our lives, rather like wartime in a way, we've had to put our plans and expectations on hold, just as people had to do in 1914 and 1939. Bring these two things together, and this has been a year that will always be remembered, 2020.
Yeah. And now we'll move on to questions from the viewers. And Robert, I hope it's all right. They're wonderful questions, but they're from all over the place in your career. So here's a question from Angela. And the question is, what was the inspiration for The Second Sleep, which I think is your last novel before this one?
Well, I wrote a lot about ancient Rome, and in the research for that, I had to read a lot of archaeological books, scholars piecing together a vanished civilization. I found all that detective work absolutely fascinating, and I wondered if there was a novel in that. And then I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if the civilization being looked into wasn't ancient, but after a while the reader realized, with a sickening sense, that they were actually looking at our world. So that was the sort of setup, as it were. And I had that at the back of my mind for a long time, a sort of I thought 18th century kind of gentleman antiquarian poking around. In the end, I set the book earlier. And at the same time, what gave it a certain urgency was there was a feeling in the air before the pandemic that something might happen. I don't know. It just seemed to me that we were due something to happen. That although the episode in my novel, which has ended the civilization or delivered a hammer blow to it, is some more to do with the cyber world, which I still think is a troubling one. Anyway, that was the origin of the book, and the idea of the second sleep, which people used to have before industrial society. Nowadays, we think, oh, you must get 7 hours sleep or 8 hours and go straight the way through. In olden times, they used to go to bed early, wake up in the middle for an hour, and then go back to sleep. I have to say, ever since I've written a novel, I've not been able to get to sleep right through the night, and maybe all the other things that are going on in the world. So I'm generally up between about 3 and 4 in the morning myself.
We've got two questions from subscriber Roger Hunt about the V2s. I'll ask the first one, which is, how effective was the German reporting of V2 strikes in England compared with our surveillance in Europe?
Well, I think we got such air superiority by then. We had fantastic images of the whole of Europe, which were all collated and studied at RAF Medmenham, which is in Danesfield House near Marlow. So that is very much part of the novel. I was absolutely fascinated by the kind of women that worked there. I mean, one, for instance, Dorothy Garrett, who was the first woman to be a professor at either Oxford or Cambridge, who was professor of archaeology, who was an expert in pre-Christian civilizations. And the skills required to study aerial photography, which came in for archaeologists in the 20s and 30s, was exactly the same, looking at Neolithic settlements, as it was for bombed German cities. So, you know, we had very good coverage. The Germans didn't have anything like it, nor did they have the spies on the ground they imagined they had, because they'd all been turned and were working for the British. And there is a suggestion that the British deliberately misled the Germans into thinking the missiles were overshooting, and so that they would fall further down, further to the south. That may have been true of the V1. I don't think it's true of the V2, simply because they were always aimed at Charing Cross Station, as far as I know, and that never varied. That was what they thought was the heart of London. And
so, to a certain extent, you think Mendeman is almost like the unsung cousin of Bletchley?
Yes, I think it is. And interestingly, women at Bletchley Park, with a few exceptions, weren't code breakers. They were more operating machinery, listening equipment, and so on. But at Medmenham, they were doing the intelligence analysis. There was a woman called Babs Babington Smith in particular. You can see where I got the name Caden Walsh from, who was red hot on the V2. And one of the things she did extraordinarily is that the British knew that the Germans were developing a jet fighter, a Messerschmitt jet fighter. And they thought it must be at Peenemünde once they realized the scale of it. So they asked her to go back over all the aerial footage of Peenemünde. And after some weeks, she found it, and it was less than 1 millimeter across. That's all that she could see. But still, it was the proof that there was a jet fighter there. So, you know, it is the unsung heroine, you could almost say, of intelligence in the war.
Incredible. And the other question from subscriber Roger Hunt is, why were the Germans firing V2s in such vast numbers on Antwerp?
Well, that was to disrupt the supply of the Allied forces in Europe. Antwerp remained in Allied hands. The whole point of the Ardennes offensive was to try and recapture it. So the Luftwaffe was no longer really capable of mounting those sorts of bomber operations. So there were 1 or 2 V2 regiments stationed in North Germany, and they fired the rockets at Antwerp. I think there's 2,700 people in London were killed by the V2, about 1,700 killed in Antwerp. Although the biggest disaster in terms of loss of human life was in Antwerp, where a cinema was hit. I think it killed more than 200 people.
And going back to other questions, here's one from Paul, who asked, did you want to change the end of The Ghost, which is your novel about a political ghostwriter, thought to be inspired by your friendship with Tony Blair, if that's right?
No, I don't think I'd want to change the end of it. I think that, you know, the book sort of stands for itself, really, as an amusement, and in a curious sort of way, life has imitated art. But I'd better not be saying any more about it.
Oh, well, do if you want to. But okay, here's another question. Carol from beautiful Cumbria says she wonders, in the Cicero trilogy, how accurate did you try to keep the storyline to the facts you found in historical research? It's like my question about the V2s, actually.
Yes, I did, actually. I did, because I thought that I wanted to write a sequence of novels which would be of some use, you know, that people could read them. Students or sixth formers or whoever could read them, and they would get a reasonably accurate picture of Roman history. And of course, it has to be a Ciceronian view, because first of all, I'm working with all his speeches and his letters and so on, and it's narrated by his own slave, his secretary. So it sticks, maybe it even sticks too closely to the facts, but I felt that that's what I had to do. I mean, because the slave who narrates the novel, Tiro, he really did write a multi-volume life of Cicero, which was lost in the Dark Ages. So, you know, the conceit which enabled me to write the novel in a way was that I had discovered it, and this was actually what it was. And Tiro's memoirs informed the history as it was written of the Roman Republic. So, you know, it was a kind of, it made me stick to the facts. And I really wanted to answer some questions like, you know, how did you speak to the Senate, 600 people? How did you address the crowd in the forum, 3,000 people, without any amplification? How did you speak for 3 hours at a time? You know, I wanted to really try and bring it to life, if I could.
And here's a question about V2. It slightly goes over what we're talking about, but it's very interesting. It's from Maria, and Maria, apologies for my bad pronunciation of place names, but Maria says her family lived in the Bezuidenhout, less than 1 kilometer from the Haagse-Bos. She was born 10th of March 1945 in Voorburg. And she asked, was the almost complete failure to hit the launch sites a result of a lack of intelligence from the Dutch resistance or inaccurate bombing by the RAF? We talked about the bombing, how difficult it was, but what was the intelligence from the Dutch resistance lacking?
Well, the Dutch resistance certainly did pass on intelligence. There was one site when as I said, the V2 launch sites were at one time moved because it was too dangerous to leave them near The Hague. They moved up the coast, and then ludicrously, the only place in range in England that they could fire at was Norfolk. So for a long time, for some weeks, they rained V2s down on Norfolk, basically frightening cows and, you know, causing alarm and despondency, but not really, I think, much loss of life. And then they were able to move back into that area, and they resumed their launches. But before they left, or just as they'd left the Norfolk launch site, the RAF carried out a pinpoint raid on the main barracks. But as luck would have it, they'd gone 12 hours earlier, so that they escaped. They left and they moved under cover of darkness to The Hague. The Hague, the launch sites it was in a strip of forested, sandy areas that run along from the Hook of Holland, right the way past The Hague and on up the coast to the east. And that was evacuated. There were very few civilians living in that area. I mean, we knew that the missiles were coming out of these woods somewhere, but the launch sites varied. And so even with the assistance of Dutch resistance, it wasn't, you know, feasible to attack them. When these pinpoint raids were failing to halt the attacks on London, then finally, and I think somewhat reluctantly, Bomber Command did decide to try and carpet bomb the woods. But they had to do it from some height, great height, because of the German anti-aircraft defense. And as so often, they missed. And they bombed the suburbs of The Hague instead. And the day that it happened is still commemorated in The Hague, the loss of life. Not with any great bitterness against the British, but just as part of the futility of war, which is really what V2 is about for me. The missile was pointless. The countermeasures didn't work. And it's about these two characters pitted against one another in this struggle. And a related question from Andrew, who asks two questions. When was the last V2 fired on London? And the second question was there any attempt by the Nazis to hide the infrastructure that created and implemented the V2 program before the end of the war? Well, the last one, I don't know the precise date, something like March the 27th, 1945, so very close to the end of the war. And that afternoon, I think it was the very last V2, maybe it was the second to last V2, it hit a block of flats, I think in Lewisham, and killed a lot of people, mainly Jewish people living in that area. So it was right to the end of the war, they were still coming down. And it was only when the territory itself was recaptured and the Germans had to pull out of The Hague, that the attacks finally ceased. The infrastructure was, Peenemünde was too great to be eradicated, and the Red Army captured a lot of that. And the Americans got the factory at Nordhausen and captured intact 100 V2 missiles, which were then shipped to the United States and, you know, taken apart so that the American Army could copy the technology. And von Braun and his engineers went to enable them to do that. And as one of my characters ruefully points out in the novel, the Russians got Peenemünde, the Germans got the V2s and the scientists, and London got the craters, which is pretty much all we got out of the whole thing at the end.
Here's another very good question from Ken, who said that his father was sent, to forgive my pronunciation, to Niedersachswerfen / Dora to collect rocket parts to be reassembled and tested by the British, fascinatingly. He therefore saw Dora firsthand. From your research, how do you view, well, he says von Braun, but how do you view von Braun and Dornberger?
Well, I mean, you know, they didn't order it. They may well have been privately shocked by it, but they didn't protest against it. So that's the level of their guilt. I mean, Dornberger served some years in British captivity and was released around 1949, 1950. Von Braun just got away scot-free and went to America. You know, culpability is obvious by association, I think. And I think in the different atmosphere that came in the 1980s, certainly, von Braun, if he'd still been alive, would probably have had a much stickier time. Of course, people were aware of the moral dubiousness of Werner von Braun, hence Tom Lehrer's celebrated song, "I send them up, don't care where they come down, that's not my department," says Werner von Braun. So, you know, people were aware that this was a bit dodgy. And once they'd actually got the technology off him and so on, the attempts to turn him into a big star, which unbelievably is what happened. He had a show, I think, that what Walt Disney put on every Sunday about space travel. And there was a heroic biopic made about him called They Reach for the Stars, or I Reach for the Stars, which, as the comedian Malt Sahl said, you know, but I hit London. You know, there was that sort of, people they weren't such fools that they didn't know what was going on.
And we touched on this as well, but a question from Andrew, who asks, did the V2 program feature much in the Nuremberg trials? We've discussed that von Braun wasn't there, but was it brought up with the others who were tried?
I don't think there was, no, I don't think it was mentioned at Nuremberg. I may be wrong, there may be viewers who can correct me, but I think that there was no trial to do with Nordhausen and Dora until quite a lot later. And you can see why, actually. I mean, given that a lot of the eyewitnesses were in White Sands, New Mexico, naturally there wouldn't be any prosecutions, would there?
And a more general question, from Monica. I haven't touched on the many film adaptations of your novels. What do you think of them generally? Is it hard to say goodbye to the book and see it turned into a different form?
No, not particularly. I mean, and it's a bit of potluck, really, whether they're good or bad or indifferent. I wasn't too happy with the first one, Fatherland, which was made by HBO. I thought Enigma was pretty good, although the ending was changed. Archangel had Daniel Craig in it, and I thought the BBC did a pretty good job with that. You know, you give over your work, you sell it. Let's face it, and it's like selling your house. And as my brother-in-law has the same experience, if you sell your house, you can't come back a year later and complain because the new owners have knocked through the kitchen. If you don't want them to do that, don't sell it. You know? So I regard it a little like having grandchildren. That you're connected to it. It's very nice, but you can hand it back. You're not responsible at the end of it. So yeah, I mean, it's always nice. There's one being made now with Jeremy Irons playing Neville Chamberlain, which I think will be could be fascinating, actually, by Netflix.
Fantastic. Well, we must wrap up there. Just to give you the results of the poll, the question was, the V2 attacks began in September 1944. Was Germany already bound to lose the war by then? And most of the viewers agree with Robert. Of the 94% say yes, Germany was bound to lose the war. 6% said no. And thank you all so much, Telegraph subscribers and to Penguin Live. And do go out and buy Robert's fantastic book. And Robert, thank you so much for appearing.
A pleasure, Harry. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for watching.
Thanks so much. Thanks.